Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jay Goodliff from the Political Science Department. Thanks for coming to our session. This is on small teaching. I'm last year at the college teaching conference, we had kind of a book club reading of small teaching, and we talked about some ideas that we had about it. And this is a follow-up discussion about that, where we've asked 4 faculty who attended those sessions to share their experiences in implementing some of the ideas of small teaching and share them with us. One of the things that I find very valuable in going to these conferences is getting some specific ideas that I can take away that I can apply in my class. And although not every idea that I hear, I figure I can apply into my class. I usually can get, if I get 3 or 4 ideas from a particular session, I feel that's been successful. And so we're going to have everyone share some ideas, and then we'll also ask for your ideas if you've been able to implement them. So the idea of small teaching, if you've been able to read the book, is that you can make not major changes into your class, but you could make small changes in your class to enhance student learning. And that could be a small change that takes place in a specific class, in a specific lecture or session, and it can be a small change that you make to the course overall. That is what is meant by small teaching. And so we're going to listen to some of these ideas. What I've passed around is, at the end of every one of the chapters of small teaching are some quick tips that are put there at the end. What I've done is I've taken all the quick tips and put them together in one handout, so that you can take this, some ideas from this, and I used this during the semester. It was easier than thumbing through the book and finding an idea that I might try in a class. And so I encourage you to think about those, if that might be useful for you, to do that. And we may have some of our presenters talk about some of those that they implemented. So we're fortunate to have a variety of excellent teachers on our panel today. We've got Karen Alman, who's from history, Jocelyn Weichel from economics, Dan Olson from geography, and Joyce Adams from the FHS Writing Lab. So what we're going to do is there's 3 main sections of the book. Those 3 main sections are knowledge, understanding, and inspiration. So I'll give you kind of a brief overview of each of those of the section, and then I'll turn the time over to each one of them to give an idea that they had in implementing it in the class. And I'll ask them to talk about what kind of class was it for, right? So was it a big class or a small class? Is it kind of a theory class? Is it an empirical class? Give some details so that people can understand how it might be applicable for their class or not. And then we'll go to the next section and do the same thing. We'll also ask for questions. And feel free to jump in if you have some clarifications, you want to ask about specific implementation ideas that someone used. So the first topic area is retrieving, and this is really, is knowledge. And the chapter's covered, the first page on the handout, retrieving, predicting, and interleaving. And what knowledge is about is that is accepting the idea that although we want to teach higher order knowledge, we have to make sure the students get the lower order knowledge. So one of the things I like to ask in one of my classes, say at the end of the semester, is, as an example, here's this ongoing illegal immigration concern that's going on in the United States. How would, say, a behavioralist or a rational choice theorist look at it versus, say, an institutionalist or a structuralist? How would they explain what's going on in the United States government right now? But nobody can answer that question unless they can explain to you what a structuralist knows, or the approach that they would take, or what a rational choice theorist does. And so you actually have to provide that knowledge, although we like the whole synthesis and comparison. If we can't provide that basic core knowledge, they're not going to be able to answer the higher order questions. So what can we do to make it so our students want to acquire, or they will help acquire? What can we do to help them to do that? So I'm going to ask Karen to share her experience on that and retrieving, predicting, and
so I one of the things I have long done is a lot of short quizzes on the reading, the day that it's due, and I was starting to feel like, because students don't love that, I was starting to feel like maybe I shouldn't be doing that, and I was trying to experiment with other things, but the small teaching said no, actually that's a really great method of getting people to remember what they read and getting them to focus on what they're reading because they know. So I continued to do that. And I went one step further and I tried to provide framing questions for them to think about as they do their reading. Because that's, history is reading and writing, it's storytelling. So I did that. The other thing I'll say that's in knowledge is one of the ideas is, or one of the main things is to interleave. That is to talk about something, move on to something else, and come back to that other thing. I didn't rejigger any classes, but I taught a new class this last semester on using DNA and genetic information in family history. And since I was creating a new class, one of the skills they need is they have to know off the top of their head, that we're third cousins once removed and what that means. Does anybody know what that means? Like really? But they have to just know it because that determines the amount of DNA and stuff like that. So we would just I had a bunch of assignments and quizzes and stuff where we just keep coming back to it. And by the end, they could do it. On the final exam, they could do it.
Were these quizzes in class or before class?
Some were online. I used Learning Suite to I handed out a pedigree and then I used that. And I just used Learning Suite and what's the relationship here. Some were practices in class where they're not graded. There's no grading stakes on it, but we just spent 10 minutes like, okay, how do we figure this out? And students who got it right away were able to help the students who didn't. The first quiz I gave on it, there were 20 points possible, and there were only 18 students in the class, and 4 of them got 2 points. So I knew I had a big hill to climb to get them. It sounds so simple, but they have to have that skill. So that's why we did more and more in class, keep coming back to it.
Thank you.
But in the case where you only had the 2, how much did you have to go back? How much time did you lose going back to cover that?
Well, for the people that didn't do very well, I made a general announcement because I didn't want, sometimes when you're a student, you don't know that you think you're the only one that failed, right? And so I just made a general announcement. I just said, if you didn't get the score you wanted, come see me. So I spent time with them personally, and then we spent time coming back to it. So.
Okay, I teach macroeconomics, which is one of the first classes that our majors take after they've had 110, and then I also teach econometrics, which is kind of a little later in the sequence. But both classes really rely on what they've learned in prior classes, and so often I'm asking students to retrieve information and expecting that they know that. And after the discussion last year, I changed some of my strategies for how to help them make these connections with what they've seen in past classes. So one thing I've done is given students, the class period before at the end of class, instead of saying, okay, goodbye, we'll see you later, I say, heads up, tomorrow we're going to start out with a talk about concept X. So please think about that between now and when we meet again. Then at the beginning of the next class, before we've even talked about anything, I just ask students, for your quiz, write down what you already know about this concept. So they're just kind of already having this practice of retrieving what they've learned before and having to push on information that maybe they haven't seen if it was like before their mission or if they took the AP high school exam. It's like sometimes they haven't seen this for a while. It brings to the surface anything they already know, and it really primes them for a good discussion, and we have a discussion on that topic rather than just jumping in cold turkey to that topic saying, okay class, we're going to start off today with a discussion on the concept. Like they can already have a chance to think about it ahead. That's been really successful, so that's helped a lot. Another thing that I've done with predicting is, I normally have questions that guide the lecture. So at the beginning of the lecture, even before last year, I would just write 3 overarching questions. And with the prediction idea, I started asking students at the beginning of the lecture, before we learned anything about the topic, to just predict the answer. So they would see this question, they would have no idea, but just kind of maybe using intuition or something, try and make a guess. And that opens them up to being able to answer or learn the answer even if they predicted it incorrectly at the beginning. So that was an easy thing to do because I was already posing the questions, just giving a little bit of space to say, what do you think these answers are, right from the beginning of class. And then finally on interleaving, that's the idea that you can make deeper connections if you go back to what they already learned on a topic and try and help students integrate the material more often. For last year's discussion, I would usually just tell people, here's what you already know about the topic, here's what you've seen either this class or from a different prior class. And now I've changed that approach to say, open it up for a question, what do we already know about this topic? Where have we seen that? Or I'll cue them and say, we've seen this in 110, or we've seen this in calculus, or we've seen this somewhere else. Cue them where in their brain to look for that information that they should already know, so that they can then answer what we already know, and then we can move forward. So hopefully that's been successful.
I found myself at the beginning of last semester having 2 classes to teach 3 classes worth of material. I'm sure none of you have ever had that problem before. And I was trying to figure out what to do with them because right after that second class, they had a test. So what I did is one of the things it talks about in small teaching is it talks about predicting. And it talks about giving students pre-tests. Now, usually what we do is we disseminate all this information to our students. We then give them a test, and then they can figure out what they know and what they don't know based upon the outcome of that test. But what if we gave them a pre-test? So prior to the actual lecture, they can figure out what they know and don't know, so when they're going through the lecture, they can pick out the things that are of most value or worth to them. So what I did, I took my lecture and I wrote down 20 questions based upon my lecture content. I gave them the 20 questions and I gave them the class period to get together with their peers and to work through these particular questions. At the beginning of next class, I went through my PowerPoint slides, but what I did was I just highlighted the slides that would answer the pre-test questions. My students had the tests, and then I asked them, the class after the test, what they thought of the pre-test. So we covered that chapter, and then when I started covering the next chapter, a student said, Professor Olson, are you going to give us a pre-test? Because obviously they found it of value, where here's a set of things that Professor Olson wants me to know, and that I should pay attention to when we are lecturing and having these discussions. And so they pay a bit more attention, highlighting things I really want them to know. It also helps them to figure out, how do I study for a test? Because can I go through the slides and create questions that test my knowledge of what I know and what I do not know? And this was for a Geography 120 World Regional Geography GE class with 120 students. And so this was a very effective and a very large class setting. Beginning of every class, of every chapter, I would come in with a handout. Here are 10 or 12 questions. I give you 5 minutes to work through it, and then I lecture and highlight where in the lecture the answers to those questions are. It helps with retention. It helps with helping them to learn how to study. So I found that really valuable, even in a large class setting, to give these pre-tests at the beginning of every section.
Thank you. Joyce?
I teach the writing and psychology class, and it is a really difficult class for students because we have all of these A students who got A's in their high school English classes. They may have tested out at university writing, and now they have to write in psychology, and they think they can just simply use the same methods, and they can't. So I found one of the things from the small teaching that was really helpful is the idea of, so for example, introductions. So I give them a reading task, or a reading on how to do introductions in psychology. And the chapters are short, maybe 6 pages. And students wouldn't bother, we know how to do introductions. They would sit through the class, yeah, we know how, it's a little different, but we know how to do this. And then they couldn't do it. And so now they read the 6 pages and write the introduction. Then they bring it to class. Then we talk about introductions. And then we can highlight the differences. Okay, that's a really good method in your English class. It will not work. We do not use that. We don't use adjectives. We don't, and guide them through. So that was something that I liked, was do the skill. It's sort of like the pre-test idea before you even come to class, and then you're ready to find out what, you've already figured out what you don't know, and you can learn it.
Before I open up for other comments and questions, I'll just share an experience also that I've had doing this in the last year. So I teach the department's statistics class, equivalent of Econ 388 for political science, which is a really disliked class in our major. And one of the things that I've struggled with is trying to get students to do the reading ahead of time before they come, so it's not just the first time they've ever seen something when they show up for class. And so I started doing these pre-class quizzes, and it had actually a whole bunch of fun effects, useful effects. So one of them is that that I would hear sometimes students say things like, I did the pre-class quiz, I just looked up the places that they were in the book and I just answered them because they're usually, I put them on Learning Suite, so I didn't want to have to do a bunch of extra work. So I just had to program it once and then I get to use it every semester after that, just adapting the questions that don't work. And so I'd hear students talking to each other, bragging about how little reading that they've done ahead of time before it, but what they didn't realize is that I had asked the 5 most important things that we're going to be covering in the lecture, so that they went and looked up in the book. They would have done 0 reading ahead of time, but they went and looked up the 5 most important things in the book for that lecture. And so when they're seeing it from me, when we're discussing it in class, it's not the first time they've seen it. They've seen it once before, and now I find that our discussions, or the lecture would go better. I didn't have to go and backtrack so much. They'd already seen those concepts. That was really useful. So I did that before every class. So that means I got 25 of them. What that also means is that they're relatively low stakes. They each count, but they count for very little. And I say, I'm going to drop 2 without, you don't have to give me any excuse. I'm dropping the 2 lowest. But then I'm someone who doesn't really believe in extra credit, even though students really like extra credit. And yet I need to motivate them to do things that they don't want to do. And so what I do is I motivate to do these things by saying, I'll drop another quiz if you fill out the teaching evaluation. I'll drop another quiz if you come and visit me in my office. I'll drop another quiz, and I don't mind giving those things away. They seem very minor to me, and it's not like I'm that. And so that's the thing that has really been useful for me in using those pre-class quizzes. Are there any other questions or experiences that people would like to share about knowledge, conveying knowledge to their students?
So what would you say is the difference between the old study outline or study sheet that we always ask for, doing the pre-test? I mean, is it just a new name for the same idea?
What do you mean by study outline?
Oh, say, what do I really need to know?
Oh.
And they list them, and I remember professors, because this is 40 years ago, but, they give us the list and say, all right, these are the things you have to know. And so that's all we focus on. And also in econ that I picked up on. But
I never had a professor give me one of those.
No.
That's real nice that you got.
Never, ever.
but it sounds like what you're doing with your pre-test or quiz is.
Sometimes I will write that on the board, like what we're gonna talk about today, so that students can see that there is a plan and there is a flow.
For like the 3 questions.
But what he's getting at is having them do the reading before they show up, before they get to the board, right? And so that's what my thread of quizzes, 5-minute quizzes, your pre-quiz does.
And it gives them accountability. When we had the old study guides, we didn't turn them in or anything like that. But now there's accountability for the students. It shows up. Turn it in, submit it. It's posted online or whatever.
And with my pre-tests, they're only for the lecture. They still have their textbook. And they don't have my full notes. So basically, don't look at any notes I've given you. Do you know the answers to these questions? Well, if you don't, you are going too soon. So pay attention, fill in the answers to the questions, and then you can say, I didn't know this before, I know this now. So this is the beginning of every single unit, not here's a whole bunch of questions to get you ready for the test. And I even tell students, these questions may or may not be on a test. I don't know if I've written a test yet, but it gives you a guideline to what you know or what you do not know.
But yours was on your lecture, not on the textbook. See, that was the
Right. I also give them that general study guide as well, but specifically for the lecture content. Again, it keeps their attention. And if I don't know this, I might need to know it, so I desperately want to know, I better pay attention.
I was just thumbing through this admirable thing, but one concern I have is I'd say maybe 1/4 of my content I change every semester. So I think a lot of this stuff works really well when you've got like a syllabus that is is sorted out, and then he can go to the next level and just kind of do all this like pre-work or whatever. Have you guys thought much about like what happens if you're just trying to be dynamic and changing the content? Like some of this like really good work gets thrown off to the side, and I want to do a lot of this stuff, but at the same time, I want to spend time making sure my content's up to date and riveting. And my goodness, I'd love to have a pre-test, but that means I have to like really know my content pretty well, and I'm just barely hanging in there. And, any suggestions about that?
Well, I'll just say that that's one of the things I liked about this book. So I teach this intro class. I taught it 3 times in the past year, and I'm teaching it again twice in the fall. And I don't change a lot of the content on that. But one of the things I liked about this book is when I felt like I was getting stale, I was like, what can I do differently? He has a lot of just really practical, try this, try that, try this out. And so I use it that way. You know, it's nothing that I have to do major ahead of time. It's just as I'm thinking the day before, oh my gosh, I'm giving that same lecture again, right? What can I do differently? I use the book for that, just to spark ideas. I'll give a little example. I was going to save it for later, but I teach this class that I don't really love teaching because it's a survey class, and I'm a colonial historian of the colonial period, and the class goes all the way up from colonial to modern day. So we get to about World War II, and it's like, you know, there's a reason we specialize in what we specialize in, and that's because I'm not interested in that World War II stuff. And and that's true even at the Civil War. And I turned to this book and I said, try doing a mind map. And so I did. I thought, I'm just going to throw out my lecture. And I did a mind map with them, which is you have a topic, a specific focus topic. I gave them a whole bunch of 3x5 English cards, and I said, you know, this is the topic. What's the impact of the Civil War on families in the North and in the South? And I write words, and then they built a whole mind map on the whiteboard. All kinds of ideas came out that I had not thought of. They were talking to each other. They're all taking pictures of it. And here's the thing, on the final exam, that's the stuff they knew the best, actually. And it just came from me saying, I have to give this lecture one more time. I don't want to do it. So.
And going back to your idea of the pre-test, my class was at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'd walk in at 8:40 in the morning to my office and say, oh, I gotta do a pre-test. Then 10 minutes, I've got my 10 questions, I've printed them off, I'm rolling off the class. So if you know what the content is, go through it quickly, pick out 10 questions, put it on a test with a little bit of room for them to write. It's really small. It's really simple to do.
And it can even be where, you know, all you really need to be is, because I've taught classes where I change the content a lot, is if you can be at least know what your next lecture is going to be. I mean, it's good to know also, but this is what my final exam question is going to be. But sometimes I don't know that, right, at the time that when I'm doing the lecture in August to figure out what's going to happen in December. But if I know what the next one is, then I can start the class. Here's what did we talk about last time? It's kind of the interleaving, especially in the predicting. Here's what we talked about last time, and then try to refer back to that frequently during that lecture to try to anchor the students, and by the way, myself, as I'm kind of learning the material as I'm lecturing about it, right? And then at the end of class saying, and what do you think we're going to talk about next? Okay, here's what we are going to talk about next. Make sure that you're ready for that, and that I'm also ready for that. And it helps a little bit of structure. Okay. Our next topic is on the next page. It's section 2 of the book. It's on understanding. The topics that are listed are connecting, practicing, and self-explaining. And the way I might describe this generally is if you're going to try to do something like active learning or flipped classroom type things, how might you try to implement that? It gives a bunch of suggestions on how you might try to implement some of those ideas. That's kind of a general approach to those sections.
Oh, I thought you were
Oh, do you want me to say something?
No.
Just bring on order.
So one thing I do is after I've discussed a topic, then I'll have it in class. I teach half the class, I teach you history and half our family history. So in the family history, it's very much about methods and practicing. And so, for example, I'll have a section where I'll talk about doing African American family history, and then I'll have an in-class exercise. and they all get points just for showing up. So the anxiety level is pretty low, and they can help each other, but they spend the whole class actually trying to do African American family history. And I picked that one because, of course, here at BYU, most of my students, I've only had one student that actually needed to do African American family history. I do that throughout the course of the semester, and they're like, 10 points kind of thing. And students say that they like that. The other thing I mentioned that I created a new class about using DNA, and instead of quizzes, I had them do, I think it was 10 short write-ups about a topic. So, like, what are the ethics of having your grandfather do his DNA test? And I would have, that's in line with their reading, and the short write-ups were supposed to be 1 page, and I told them that they're to imagine they're explaining this to their parents or their grandparents or a friend who knows nothing about it, and it's this concept in the book, they call it self-explaining. So they're teaching the concept to somebody, an imaginary person. And I'd get these papers, and they were wonderful, and I could tell right away people who understood the issues and people who didn't. I think I had 10 of those assigned. Again, very low points, and I wasn't too worked up about the grammar and all of that. I was concerned about the thinking. And at the end of the semester, because it was a new class, I did kind of a post-mortem on the class, like what worked for you, what didn't. And they all said that they really appreciated that those assignments were really helpful for them because it forced them to think through things. So I'm doing it in other classes.
A lot of what I do for understanding has to do with this connecting idea. In my macro class, I find, do you guys find this with your students? The events have to be current events. Like, you can't use something from 2012 because they were in middle school.
Right.
Okay. So I feel like I'm constantly updating my material for that class in particular to make sure that my events are current events. And that helps with these connections a lot more because, it takes a little bit of work on my part to be constantly looking for these current events and working them in. But it means that's what they're seeing every day in the headlines, and they're able to make those connections a lot better than if I use kind of outdated or old examples. So it does take a little bit of work, but I feel like it really does reinforce on this connecting part. Another thing I do with connecting that I should have been doing sooner is listening to students when they make comments. So sometimes students, you ever have this experience, a student will raise their hand and they'll say, how does this relate to, and they say something that in my mind is like, it's totally like a different idea, or, like we're talking about different modeling, that kind of stuff. And I've started trying to help students, walk through step by step how those two are connected and what it would mean for those to be connected, as opposed to why in our particular narrow framework they're not so connected, but they could be if we expanded on this dimension or this channel. I try and help students reinforce these connections that they're seeing instead of trying to shut that down and saying, that's not related, we're doing something completely different, right? So taking the time to see that connection and help understand why students are making that connection and see what would it take for that connection to be strong versus weakened has been a really valuable teaching technique that it's not something you can prepare for in advance, you just have to kind of do it in the classroom, but it's helped a lot with students being able to deepen their understanding and understand the frameworks we're in and the assumptions that we're making. Another thing that's been really important is practicing. I just wasn't giving students enough time to practice problems, and so they would come to my class, get all this theory, get all these ideas, and then feel really like they were just dropped in the deep end when it came time for homework and exams. And so I've started taking a little more time in class, and I don't do this every time, but sometimes I'll do this. I'll just set up group works. I'll say, turn to your neighbor, group of 2 or 3, we're not moving anywhere, you're just spending the next minute discussing in this small group, talking to each other about how to set this up. So I brought an example of one of these things that I do. I just set up, like, after we've gone through the whole model, I'll say, here's a practical example. You're gonna answer questions 1, 2, and 3. They're pretty easy. I mean, it takes like 3 minutes for them to get through all this and start to set up the model, and they're not, I mean, it's clunky. And they're talking to each other and trying to figure out, how do I apply this new idea? And then, so I'll give them the space to do that, and instead of just say, here's our model, now I'm gonna work through a practical example, I just pause and give them 2 or 3 minutes to start trying on their own. So that way, when I actually show the practical example, they're like able to identify, here's how far I got, and here's where I got stuck, and they're just a lot more open to understanding how these problems work. So just creating a little more space for this group work has been really great. Just to stop for like 2 minutes and let people talk to each other, correct each other, and help each other has like really improved their problem solving abilities and their ability to like apply what we're learning in class beyond. So that's been really helpful. It's also great because it gives me a chance to like erase the board while they're busy, and I feel like I'm not wasting that board time while I was just staring there watching them do that. So anyway, so that's helped with my understanding in class.
Another class I teach is Geography 250, US and Canada. It's a regional geography course. I'm a Canadian, which is probably why they put me in that class. And it's interesting, you can actually take a look at the title at the university. It's not US and Canada, it's us in Canada. So that adds a really interesting dynamic to the fact that I'm Canadian with a bunch of Americans in this class, but I digress. I'm a big believer of the process of scaffolding and writing. Usually what happens is you have students write an essay, which is generally their rough draft, but they're given final draft status or grades for it. So I believe in giving them multiple opportunities to write in order to get feedback so that their final version is their true final version, not the rough draft. One of the things that I do in this 250 class is I ask them to write a 4-page essay on some of the differences between the United States and Canada. What I do for my scaffolding, though, is instead of them bringing in a rough draft, their peers review it and give feedback, I ask each of the students to come in with their draft, and then they have to give a 3-minute presentation on the themes and the topics that they were going to talk about or write about. What happens is that you'll find the topic being shared by multiple students. But one student will say, we want to talk about healthcare, here's one way of looking at it. Another student says, here's another way of looking at it. So the first student says, oh, I was right, but I can also add a different dynamic to my comments. And so what happens is they get this feedback from each other, or, oh, I didn't think about that as a difference, maybe I want to add that, and so they write down some notes. They come back a week later with their final draft. So this goes back to this idea of self-explaining, where the learners benefit from explaining out loud what they are doing during the completion of a task. In this sense, they are completing the writing of a mini essay, but they are verbalizing it. It's kind of like giving a talk in church, where we know the doctrine, but we truly know the doctrine when we can distill it and share it in a 5 or 10-minute block. And that's basically what I'm asking them to do here. Not just write it, but to verbalize it, and then go back and rewrite it again. And that makes the quality and the depth of the essays, as I've looked at semesters where I haven't done this, and semesters where I have done this, the qualities of the essays, the depth of the essays are much a higher quality when they have a chance to verbalize the process of that writing process as I go through the scaffolding.
Karen talked about the mind map, the concept map. One of my frustrations in trying to help students in writing and psychology is they're so afraid that they won't have enough to say to fill 10 full pages. And so I'll say it has to be a narrow slice of the topic. We'll talk about what that means, give examples, and sure enough, somebody's chosen drinking as their topic. And so I mean, literally I was in the middle of class one day and I was so frustrated because they still had these massive topics. And so I said, let's do a concept map. Everybody draw your own. I'll do mine on the board so you get an idea of where I'm going. And I said, put your topic in the main circle. And I always use the example of arthrogryposis, because if I use any other example, I'll get 10 papers on that, like birth order, 10 birth order papers. And I have yet to have a student interested in arthrogryposis. So they don't want to write it out. So I put arthrogryposis in the middle, and they said, you can't get any more narrow than that. It's a neurological condition. And I said, let's see. Okay, a person with arthrogryposis, the physical problems, mental challenges, insurance costs, the burden on the caregiver, and that was really shocking to think that you could break down orthogreco. So I made them do that. They had to break it down into that one circle. I said, okay, now choose one of those, just one of the ones that you have on the outside of that circle. I want you to do it again. And it really made them start thinking about it, and it at least got us to a better place in talking about how to narrow the topic. They weren't thinking broadly enough. I mean, they need to narrow, but they, like drinking, they didn't think about all the other consequences that could fill volumes on that topic. So that was one that I really appreciated, was the concept map. It's not something I'd ever used before, ever, and at least for that day, it was successful.
I like Jocelyn, I've also had some good experience with in-class writing or in-class exercises, and I use them in different ways at different points in the semester. So early in the semester, I use it a little bit differently. I usually go through, explain a concept for, say, a methods class, then I'll show a specific application of it where something's solved, and then I'll put a slide up and say, okay, this is now for you to solve with your partner. And now we're gonna do that for 3 minutes. And it's a nice time to make a break for me. That's one of the nice things. But it's also, I usually go and I have them pair up, and then I usually go join one of the groups. And so over the course of the semester, I get to pair up with almost every group, even though there's 60 people in the class. We do 2 or 3 of them in every class. And so by the time through the semester, I will have sat down next to almost everybody in the class at some point or another and worked with them on a problem. That's what we do at the beginning of the semester, where it's kind of trying to apply basic concepts. And at the end of the semester, I try to do questions that will get them ready for the final exam or for a midterm exam. Well, I'll say, okay, here's a question that was on the midterm exam last year or last semester. Now you're going to work on it with your colleague right now. Or it might even be, since this is, work on this by yourself, just like you were in the test. Don't open your book, see how well you can do it. Let's see how it. And the other nice thing about it, besides getting them practice, and sometimes it self-explains to their neighbor, is it also breaks up the class. So it's not 75 minutes of me straight talking. Within 15 or 25 minutes somewhere, we're going to stop 2 or 3 times during the class period and take a break, change things around, which will help keep people's attention. That's at least I've liked a lot better that way. What other experiences have you had or questions that you want to ask some of our panelists?
I have a question for you. Do you then have them share what they did in their group for the rest of the class?
Yes, usually I have somebody. Sometimes sometimes I'll the group that I'm sitting down with that I've made sure have solved it correctly, I will say that they are going to share it. So they go and share how they solved the problem with the rest of the class. That's right. So thanks for reminding me of that. And then sometimes I won't have done that, and so I'll just ask for a volunteer or all and see what we can do. But most of the time it's the group that I sat with. Okay. Our last topic, this is on page 3 of the handout. This is called inspiration. And what inspiration is about is helping students, and to some extent ourselves, harness our emotions and attitudes to want to be, from BYU's perspective, lifelong learners, but especially wanting people to learn within your class and outside of your class. And the topics on that are motivating, growing, and expanding. Would you like to start again, Karen?
Sure. So under motivating, one of the things it says to do is to come early and talk to students. And I've always done that. I've also always made them come see me and attach some points to it. Even when I was teaching the U.S. History Survey, and it was a big, huge class, and it's a big time commitment, but it's worth it. Things come up there, and then I found that if I make them come see me for 5 minutes earlier on in the semester, when they're struggling later on, they're not hesitant to come see me. I was the kind of student, I don't think I ever in my entire undergraduate career ever spoke to a professor, and I want to avoid that happening. I also always, when I teach the family history classes, I always do a project along with them. So I'm teaching the U.S. South, I'll do a U.S. South project, and I'll refer to that as I was going, and I do that mostly for me, so I have some more experience, you know. But I had actually in this past semester, I had 3 students just kind of casually say, "We really appreciate that you do that because it's a good experience for me because I'm stumbling across the same issues they're stumbling across, and so they appreciate seeing how someone out of college is doing that." And I guess the thing I'll say last for time's sake is history lends itself to telling stories, and I think I realized after my first year here that I wasn't telling enough stories, and it's the stories the reason I like history, and so I've started to include more stories, and I think that's motivating, and I think it helps people see how it can apply, and we'll have discussions on them. I'll give you a quick example. As I mentioned, I teach some family history classes, and I had them do this whole exercise in class where they're helping each other and everything, and then we get all done, and it's actually my family. It's obviously my family. It's the same surname. And I explained to them that in this family, although there are 6 children that they could find in the census, and they could find actually only one of them, my line, has a direct descendant. Everyone else, their lines die out. And so I use that as an opportunity to explain to them why it's so important from a genealogical perspective to look at the spouses and their children, but especially from a theological perspective, no one else was doing that work. And I've had students come back and mention that little story had a big impact on them. So that's one way I try to get them to expand and engage with what's going on is more stories.
Yeah, I've increased storytelling too. I think that's been an effective tool. And I only have so many personal experiences or stories, especially. And so I've also used stories of other people that I respect. Like often, if I'm reading a biography of an interesting figure, I can find something about that person's life that could apply to a concept in class, and that's also effective. So it doesn't just have to be like my own personal testimony of a concept. It's been really effective to use other people and their stories as well, and incorporate that. In terms of growing, and I love this idea of providing early opportunities for success. I've started, after last year, I started doing one-on-one research conferences for one of my classes. We have an independent research project, and students all have to come up with their own topic and get going. And I realized that if they had the opportunity to sit down with me one-on-one early in the process, it was a much better experience for them. It helped them get momentum sooner. It helped them realize that I support them and that I'm interested and invested in them. And then it saves a lot of time long run, because then it saves time for students to not spin their wheels, but it also saved a lot of time in terms of them coming later in the semester and not knowing how to get going or being stuck. We could just preempt a lot of issues by sitting down for 10 minutes together early in the semester. So that's been really a good strategy to think about, helping students early on in a more one-on-one way. In the expanding section, we really talked about staying committed to being a good teacher and trying to improve those skills, and I thought that was a good concept. One thing that I find myself doing with this in mind is that every time I'm in a situation where I'm listening to somebody, whether it's in Sunday school or a discipline, like a seminar within my department or just anywhere on campus, I find myself sitting and listening to people and learning from them. And one thing I try and do is kind of ask myself, what are they doing that's successfully teaching this concept right now? What is it that they're doing that's helping them communicate this information? Is it visual presentation? Is it the way they're explaining things? Is it, so I just try and analyze what makes a good teacher. I had the experience where I heard a paper presented, the same paper, but presented by 2 different co-authors. And so it really was like a great opportunity for me to say, wow, I understood it so well when presenter A happened, and when presenter B, it wasn't clear, and what was the difference in that? So sometimes I just find myself analyzing other teachers for ideas about ways to improve teaching, and that can be useful just to understand if I could implement something that they're doing.
Are any of you familiar with the Writing Across the Curriculum group here on campus? Have any of you ever been to any of their lunches by chance? One of the things that they do is they have some great things. They have spring modules. They have a writing workshop for a week where if you do all the homework and rework a course, they give you $1,000 in your research account. They also have a book club, and that's something that most people aren't aware of. I've been in this book club ever since I've been here, 2014. We've been looking at books such as The Sense of Style, A Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century, Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, The Meaningful Writing Project, Small Teaching, and this year we're doing iGen, why today's super connected kids are growing up less rebellious, more tolerant, less happy, and completely unprepared for adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. So what has happened is, with these book clubs, I read this book, we get together once a month for 3 months during the summer, we have an hour discussion on these things, and we talk about ways that we can apply these teaching principles in our classrooms. And so I've been able to make some really small changes, not just through the small teaching book, but also through this discussion with other professors. I almost wish we had an FHSS book club in this sense, where we could get together during the summer months when some of us have a slightly lighter teaching load, and we can actually focus on our teaching and how to make it better. So if you haven't heard of this Running Across the Curriculum book club, I'm happy to chat with you about it. Get involved, pick a book every year, read it during the summer, and think about what can I do to make my teaching that much more effective this coming year.
This example that I want to share is one, I've been aware for the last couple of years that I'm not providing enough of the practical value of some of the skills they're learning. They're practical for doing well in psychology, but I'm failing to give them, like, so how does this help me as relief secretary? Those kinds of things. So on one particular day I was teaching transitions that I was struggling because I would read either paragraph by paragraph or even sentence by sentence, and I couldn't see the relevance between them. It was like a paragraph of 10 sentences, and each sentence was its own world. And so I had them all pull out their phones. I don't let them use technology in my class. They all pull out their phones, so that was a novelty. And I said, find your favorite scripture passage. And that shocked them, what are we doing? And then I just asked for volunteers. Anybody want to read their favorite scripture? So the first person read it, and I would look it up as well, and I would have it so I could read along. So after the first person read their favorite scripture, I said, okay, just let me read it a little bit differently. And so I would emphasize, therefore, and then to show them that literally at the beginning of almost every single sentence, there's something to tie them together. And then after I did it that once, then I had more volunteers and I didn't have to read it again. They picked that up really fast. So that's one of the things that like I say, I'm still working on a lot, but that I'm trying to help them see that I don't always need to choose my examples from a psychology article. I need to get better about, like you say, maybe it's the church handbook that we're looking at and we're learning to look at structure or other kinds of things to help them see the bigger picture of the value of what they're learning.
One of the things that I found to be useful in my methods course that's unpopular is if you look on the growing section, it says include a tips for success section in your syllabus. So I do that. So I write down, here are the things that most students that are successful in the course have done. And then it's a data analysis course, so I actually have a survey at the beginning of the class and a survey at the end of class. And at the survey at the end of class, I ask, because I like data, that's why I'm teaching the course. So I actually have a survey after every assignment, so it's really lots of data. But at the end of the class, I ask them, what advice would you give to students that are going to take the course next semester? And then I gather all that information together and try to distill it, and I show that to the students at the beginning of the next class, or I show it at critical periods during the class, like after the midterm is distributed, after they get the midterm back, when they're disappointed, and where it's things like, you can do this and it's worth it. And I also get emails from students after the fact, after being away after graduating 1 or 2 years that say, you know, this thing that you made me do at the time, which I really hated, it turns out to be really useful, and here's how it was useful. Even though I went to law school, I didn't think I'd ever have to do data analysis, it turned out to be really useful. Or I'm working for Congress in this committee, and it turns out to be really useful. And I show those as motivation to the students. Here's how this class is going to be useful for you, even though you don't think it's going to be useful yet. Here's all these people who didn't think it was going to be useful. And it's now, because I've been teaching this course for many years now students will even mention in their email, and you can share this with the rest of the class. Because they know I'm going to take that email and I'm going to share it with the rest of the class, and I don't even have to ask for the permission. They put the permission right in the email. And that gives them some motivation to work on things that they sometimes find not as appealing as some other classes. What other questions or other suggestions that you have that on this topic overall? Sam, do we have to fill something out? You said you want us to fill.
Just make sure you fill out the survey. It's teachingconference.byu.edu, or you can scan that little.
I will say, I looked at his rate, my professor. He has a high score. His class is really easy.
So I'd like to thank all our panelists for participating, and thank you for coming.